What a pleasure to welcome historian, journalist, essayist, and educator Jelani Cobb to the New York State Writers Institute. Tonight's guest this year marks a decade as the Ira A. Lippman Professor of Journalism at Columbia University, where he became the founding director of the Lippman Center for Journalism and Civil and Human Rights. Since 2022, he has been dean of Columbia's Story Journalism School, which has produced a number of excellent reporters I've been lucky enough to work with. Born in Queens in 1969, Cobb is a graduate of Howard University, where he began his writing career, and received his PhD in American history at Rutgers before embarking on a career that has produced books on subjects as diverse as anti-communism within the civil rights movement, the hip-hop aesthetic, and the implications of Barack Obama's 2008 election and his 2 terms in office. Cobb's latest book, compiling more than a decade of reporting and analysis primarily for The New Yorker, is 3 or More is a Riot, Notes on How We Got Here, 2012 to 2025. The collection starts with the death of Florida teenager Trayvon Martin, gunned down on his way back from a convenience store, continues through the protests that followed the 2015 death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, mass killings by racist gunmen in El Paso and Charleston, South Carolina, and then the national reckoning of 2020, prompted by yet more deaths, including those of George Floyd of Minneapolis and Breonna Taylor of my own hometown, Louisville, Kentucky. The book ends with a very different sort of reckoning, the second election of Donald Trump. It's an event that, not to give away a bracing ending, puts the author in mind of how people must have felt when the Supreme Court issued the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson decision that allowed segregation to exist alongside the Bill of Rights. There are side trips into film analysis, the loss of cultural figures ranging from John Lewis to the journalist David Carr, and explorations of the places where Cobb developed as a student, including Jamaica High School and Howard University. As the author notes in his afterword, these pieces, when assembled, are unintentionally autobiographical. To hear more about the book, our times, and a remarkable career, please join me in welcoming Jelani Cobb. Can you explain the title for people who might not be familiar with the phrase and its use in criminal law?
So there's a story to it. First off, I have to tell you, my father could never answer a yes or no question without 3 or 4 anecdotes. And I'm my father's son. So buckle up. I was in Charleston, and I was covering the trial of Dylann Roof. If you don't recall, Dylann Roof was the 21-year-old white supremacist who killed 9 people in the sanctuary of the Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. And he had done so because, in his words, he thought that black people were, quote unquote, taking over. And there had been this paranoia about demography in South Carolina that went all the way back to the colonial era, because South Carolina was the only one of the 13 colonies that had a majority black population. And there was a kind of paranoia that grew out of the fact that the enslaving class was literally surrounded and outnumbered by the people whom they were holding in bondage. Then following a slave revolt in 1739, the Stono Rebellion, the South Carolina legislature passed a law that effectively defined a slave revolt as 3 or more Negroes, as they would then have been called, outside the company of a white man. So you could not be together. And it was like that kind of ancestral fear of numbers that was connected to what had happened in Charleston. And then as I was kind of looking at these other pieces and the other locales and the thread that they were tying these things together, including kind of big themes in American politics and the level of discord that we have now, and it was about demography too. And so it was like 3 or more is a riot. And there were so many kinds of tense things that were connected to at that point. So I thought about that, and it was like the phrase kept bouncing around in my head. And so I decided that should be the title of the collection.
At the risk of being accused of nitpicking, the final piece in the book is from November 2024. So was there intentionality between having 2025 in the subtitle of the collection?
No, what had happened was there was a piece that ran in January of 2025 that was cut for length. They never revised. That is a true editor's catch. No one has caught that.
We're pains in the ass,
Yes,
aren't
exactly.
we? Yes.
But I was like, I'm glad, because I feel like I can confess my sins now, because when I realized this, the book was already in production, but I was like, someone's going to eventually put this together.
It can't be tonight.
Right.
Is it tonight?
It can't be tonight. But I kept getting away with it,
Ladies and gentlemen, the book you are being sold in the lobby of this room is in fact faulty.
Right, exactly.
So.
It's faulty. I'm guilty of false advertising. Actually, I'm not, because I'll just tell you about the things I wrote in 2025.
Right. I was thinking there might be sort of some very philosophical understanding that, yeah, that's right, the book ends at the close of 2024, but it's about what's happening when the book came out in 2025.
Yeah, no, that's not it.
Right. So the book begins in 2012, the year of Trayvon Martin's death, but also in a way in sort of the what arguably could be called the final cresting of Barack Obama's potency, perhaps, as a political figure. There's a fascinating postscript to Barack X, which is your piece kind of about that period in his political history, that acknowledges how much to come after was in some way a reaction, literally in sort of the double sense of that word, to Obama's election and then his 8 years in office.
Yeah. And so the way that the breakdown for those pieces occurred, and almost kind of, we were thinking about how to organize the collection, and we thought of it as a 3-act play. There was the second Obama administration, there was the first Trump administration, and then there was the Biden administration, and the collection closes just as the 2024 election has brought Trump back into power. And so it's kind of an arc that I was thinking about. And first off, Donald Trump's raison d'etre as a political figure is Barack Obama. He exists because Barack Obama exists. And his agenda had been to not only wipe out everything that Obama achieved, but to eliminate the dynamics that had made an Obama presidency possible, which is why so much of what he has done politically has been an inversion of the civil rights movement. Barack Obama is a product of the civil rights movement. Structurally, the Voting Rights Act is integral to Obama's ability to be elected, or anyone to have been elected with the kind of demographic coalition he had. And so there's that. And there's this extended wake in which the politics that have succeeded Obama are largely a product of him. Now, there's some things about Trump's particular psychology and his particular orientation as an individual and so on, sure. But what he is by and large reacting to is the existence of Barack Obama.
There was a sense after 2020 in some circles that Trump's election in 2016 was an aberration, that in the same way that only the George W. Bush presidency and the economic collapse at the close of it, that was what it took to give us, or to have a black president be elected, that Trump's election was in some way sort of, as you put it, sort of the pendulum swinging back. But as you were looking at the pieces that go into this collection, was there sort of a sense that more people should have kind of seen Trump's second election coming, that it was in fact very much kind of in the American vein?
Yeah, I think it was very much in the American vein. There were all these other things that mitigated Kamala Harris's ability to be an effective kind of foil or counterpoint to him. And at the same time, there's this long historical tradition that Trump represents and is part of. And when we think about, like, so we have these conversations about authoritarianism currently, and autocracy, and I want to jump out the window every time we start talking about autocracy, and then we jump back to Europe in the 1930s, because we're cooking the history books by doing that. Like, in 11 states of the former Confederacy, they simply decided that 4 amendments to the Constitution didn't exist. And they proceeded for a century of history with being able to get away with that. We saw the 13th Amendment wasn't completely eviscerated, but the South pioneered this form of re-enslavement of people through sharecropping and through convict leasing and so on. The evisceration of the 14th Amendment, the complete rejection of the 15th Amendment, which gave the right to vote to black men, and the rejection of the 19th Amendment, which gave the right to vote to all women, including black women. And so if you have a effectively single-party state for 100 years, and you can nullify the highest law of your land, ignore the Supreme Court, you can do all of these things, and you think that you have to go across the Atlantic to find examples of autocracy.
It brings to mind in the episode of Saturday Night Live that Dave Chappelle hosted right after Trump was elected, and I think it was one of the very first skits that it was a group of friends. All the white people are saying, I can't believe, how could this have happened in America? And I think Chappelle and one of the Black Cast members were like,
Rock,
oh yeah. Was it Chris Rock?
It was Chris Rock,
who was like, yeah, I think I know how this could have happened.
Yeah, I think I know how this could happen, yeah. And people had this sense, that he represents a particular kind of tradition, and they're literally cooking the books now to make it more difficult for you to understand what their origin story is. Like, they're removing the plaques and removing the kind of references to the non-complementary parts of American history, and they're trying to turn the nation's past into a resume. And on a resume, it's like notable. You can get a sense of a person's achievements, but you don't get a sense of any of their mistakes. You never list that on a resume. Although I think it would be interesting if we did. We could pioneer the brutally honest resume. It's like, are there any children in here? There are no children. So you have like a section, a caption, that just be like, fuck ups, And so like, oh, I really messed this up. Wait, this is going on YouTube too, right? I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. A number of the pieces do come with afterwards, Barack X being one of them. I was just wondering, when did you want to add an afterward to some of these pieces, and when were you happy to let them kind of stand alone? The afterwards are fascinating in sort of the retrospective look that they give.
Yeah, I thought, I was talking with Chris Jackson from One World, and he thought, because I was imagining these things as kind of plotting a certain course of a little bit more than a decade of history, and he said it would be really interesting to kind of bring those pieces to the present, and there wasn't any rhyme or reason to which ones I did postscripts for. It's just pieces where I felt like I had something to say, or I had learned something different, from what I thought in the moment, or sometimes I just thought I was wrong, like, okay, I was really like off the mark here. And so they became kind of an exercise to see what my batting average had been like. And, in some of the other instances, the postscripts verged upon becoming their own essays, where I was kind of like, okay, I have to cut this off because I'm responding to something else. One of the more notable things is I think I became much more skeptical in most of the postscripts. I think are more skeptical than the original pieces, if I were thinking about that, because I was looking around at what we've allowed to happen in the intervening years.
But the collection itself is so mournful in so many ways because it is punctuated by so many deaths, so much injustice over the course of the decade plus under consideration.
It is, and I think that I kind of grappled with that because I didn't want it to be a book that was too difficult for people to sit with, and at the same token, I was like, this is the history that I came across and the things that I was witness to. And I began to see these linkages and these things that were connective tissue. The first thing that I ever wrote for The New Yorker was about Trayvon Martin, a 17-year-old who had been killed. And at the time that I wrote it, it was a news blip. Like, Trayvon Martin's name was not recognizable. And my editor at The New Yorker at the time, Amy Davidson, was like, why don't you look at this thing that's happening down in Florida? And I was like, okay. And I was skeptical because the facts of the case seemed like something was left out. Okay, an unarmed 17-year-old was shot by an armed 30-something-year-old who pursued him around a gated subdivision and then shot him and claimed self-defense. Okay, something else happened. I later learned that the attorney that represented Trayvon's family, Benjamin Crump, who was not nearly as well known then as he is now, he had the same reaction. He was like, okay, there's something else that's in this story. And then finding out that that really was what happened, and that the law in Florida is like, it canonizes that concept of football that the best defense is a good offense. And so, it conflates self-defense with the idea of being able to go on the offense. And at the end of that piece, Amy said to me, why don't you follow this story and see where it goes? And I felt like 13 years later, I'm still doing that.
There's so much good cultural analysis in the book as well, to kind of take away from the analysis of so many horrible crimes. The writing on Steven Spielberg's Lincoln, Django Unchained, Queen and Slim, and Black Panther. As we sit here 2 weeks before the Oscars, you did a wonderful profile in The New Yorker of Ryan Coogler not quite a year ago, I think right as Sinners came out.
Yeah, that's the piece that didn't make it to the end.
Really?
Yeah, it is.
Okay, well here, this is where I pay off the title of the book by asking about the piece that should have been in there.
Right.
So what do you make of everything that's happened in the almost year since that piece ran and since Sinners came out? It's incredible box office success. The fact that it has been critically, adored, I would say.
Yeah.
And also the fact that it's the most nominated film in Academy Award history.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. And so, for people who are writers or people who are journalists, this kind of happens sometimes, which is that I spoke to Ryan Coogler, because that piece came out about a year ago. I spoke to him 2 years before that. And, I was like, I want to do something on you. Let's get together, let's talk. And I went out to Oakland and we hung out, and I was like, what are you working on? It's like, I'm thinking about doing this, and I'm thinking about doing that, and so on. And I got a lot of interesting stuff about him, but I didn't have a thing to hang it on. And I was like, well, I'll come back to this. There'll be something, or whatever. And then a year goes by, and he tells me, like, hey, I got a film coming out. And I was like, you weren't working on anything, like, when last time I spoke to you. He said, yeah, I did something that's going to come out. And I was like, what is it about? And he said, it's about vampires and the blues. And I was like, all right, okay. But it's like, I reacted to that the way you would react if like a friend called you and said, I just met the perfect woman in Vegas. We're getting married next week. You'd be like, you make your own decisions. But I didn't really know. Like, I was like, what are you doing with it? But also, he's like a really, really creative person, yeah. And so I was like, all right, I'm intrigued. So I came out. I met him in L.A. And this has been the fires and the aftermath of fires in L.A. And he was editing this film, and the reason it had happened in that window was that he wrote this script in kind of a blur, and then reached out to his agent and was like, I want to make this, but the only way I can make it is if we make it really quickly. And he said they went through the entire bidding process. It landed at Warner Brothers, and they started shooting like 3 months later. It was like insane. And they did this film. And so I saw a rough cut of it, and I was stunned because it was so original. It had all of these layers, to it, and it also resonated with. I had written a book. One of the books I'd written was about hip hop and the blues, and it was about some of those themes of like the blues as a spiritual practice, and the way it relates to these African traditions that abided Black culture throughout slavery, despite slavery, and so on. And so I immediately connected with where he was going with this film on some of those levels. But I saw the film like 5 times, and I got something out of it with each viewing. And so the thing that I worried about, though, was that I was like, this film is so different that I was worried that people wouldn't know what to do with it. And it was like, oh, this might just be something that's like, there's like you could teach a whole seminar.
My brother's an American studies professor, and I was like, dude, you could teach a whole class on this and how it relates to all these other strings of.
Sure. I was going to say you could teach a whole class on brilliant cinema that people didn't grasp at the time. And it took like years. It became like a cult classic because people, and I was like, are people going to actually get where he's going with this? And then it opened, and like people couldn't get enough of it, and they kept going back to see it and kept back to see it again and again. And so that became, the profile had been about that narrative, and just the way that he has matured and developed as an artist, which has been amazing to see.
What should we make of the fact that Sinners and One Battle After Another, which is explicitly a film about resistance, political resistance, and race, in America are the 2 clear frontrunners for Best Picture, or is it just the fact that Ryan Coogler and Paul Thomas Anderson make really good movies?
I think it's the latter.
That it's not a political.
I mean, that happens after the fact. Like, if you make a movie that sucks but has the right politics, it's just going to suck. If you make a movie that is brilliant but has the wrong politics, it'll be controversial. But the people who love the art will like forgive you your political kinds of wanderings, and other people will say like, "Oh, okay, I can't because of this." But if you make a film that's brilliant and the politics resonate with how a lot of people are feeling but are not able to articulate themselves, then you wind up with, One Battle After Another and Sinners, like these 2 amazing films that are entirely applicable to the moment we find ourselves in right now.
I have a friend who's very conservative who said that she doesn't want to watch, she's not looking forward to watching the Oscars because she's sure that they're going to make it political. And of course, my response was, it's always been political.
It always has been,
and
right.
this is probably not the year you're going to want to watch it because vampire musical set during Jim Crow and
Right.
a movie it seems like it's ripped from the headlines today. So.
Yeah, also I think the thing that's interesting, if I go back for a second, about Sinners, is that he explicitly does not make a film that is a simple black-white metaphor. Like, the vampires are not a simple metaphor for the system that has been exploiting black people, or even for kind of exploiting the blues and the culture, and those artists are certainly exploited. But the vampirism is a kind of like spiritual other path. And there's Christianity and there's the blues, and he's sorting through this idea of like what's actually true. And I love the fact that the character Remick, who is a villain heretofore, to this point, but when there's a character with Sammy, the moment where Sammy starts saying the Lord's Prayer. And everyone thinks that this is going to present like salvation. I'm sorry if this is a spoiler. I feel like I've had ample time to see this film. But he starts saying the Lord's Prayer, and Remick, the vampire, joins in with him and says that these words were forced upon me. He's Irish. And he said, these words were forced upon me by the people who stole my father's land, but I still find comfort in them. And that was just a mind-blowing level of connection, because that is suggesting some of the complexity with which these people who are former slaves, for many of them, not all, but for many of them, their introduction to Jesus happens in a slave ship. But they still find solace in some way through this tradition, this faith. And so I just thought that was amazing.
Complete change of subject. What is it like leading a journalism school these days in this particular political educational moment? Do you find that students are more eager to enter the profession because of the state of the nation, or more kind of baleful about the prospects for their careers in an industry that can seem besieged on every side?
Both. So what's happened, fewer people are going to journalism school, not shocking to people. You think about what's happening in the media landscape in the United States. But the people who are going to journalism school are really, really motivated. And so they want to report, they want to go out, they want to dig, they want to break stories. They know what a story is. That's been like the kind of shrinkage in the enrollment across the country in journalism schools, journalism institutions, has left a very serious, highly motivated core of people. And so, which is, I think, the metaphor here is almost a metaphor for what's happening in journalism, because it's easy for us to talk about the doom and gloom, but I contend that if we weren't distracted by the black clouds hanging over our profession, we would actually be exalting this moment as incredibly dynamic and incredibly fertile, that we have people experimenting with new business models. We have people experimenting with new modes of delivery. We have the capacity to do investigations in a way that prior generations of journalists couldn't even imagine. And AI is going to be disruptive. It already is disruptive, and it will cost some jobs. It will also simultaneously empower us to do journalism in a way that will make us even more capable of kind of finding the truth and delivering it to our audiences. And so I think that we have to keep both of those things in mind.
In particular, what has it been like to be an educator at Columbia, which has been something very close to kind of ground zero for, both the activism that followed or that flowed from the war in Gaza, and then the Trump backlash right up to last week's. We were discussing the Columbia student who was scooped up by ICE.
Yeah, she was seized by ICE. And I think that it's been difficult and it's been tumultuous, and there have been a lot of kind of fraught conversations. We are. I'm always raising the question of what is a university for? Like when I'm in conversations about whatever the difficult thing that we're navigating is. And I think that when we ask ourselves the question, when we have an answer to that question of what a university is for, it's easier to figure out what you should then do. And one of the things that, and also I have to say that because I'm a dean, there's some stuff I can't talk about for legal reasons, and there's some stuff like layers of different kinds of confidentiality that I can't get into. But one thing that I will say is that all of the pictures are more complicated than they appear to be on first blush. And I know that as someone who has been in the room. And the university has done things that I disagree with, that I've been internally critical of, but everything that has happened, and things that I was very proud of also. The nature of this circumstance is that people know more about the things they dislike than they do about the things that they really would be impressed by if they actually were in the room. But even in the course of things that I really disagreed with, I understood how people came to the positions they came to. And so it just none of it was simple.
That's often the case in journalism as well, that people know more about the things that they disagree with, that went wrong, than they do it's like the plane that lands safely and on time.
Right, exactly. Or American intelligence, which I don't think I necessarily want to go making metaphors about that. But one of the things that people were talking about is that with the nature of the intelligence community is that people only know your screw-ups. The things that you do that save the lives of 10,000 people are by necessity not known.
So my last question, and then I want to make sure we have time for the audience to pose a few. We were having a very nice dinner just before we came out here, and I noted that one question that I always ask job applicants is, and there's a follow-up that but I will save it until the audience, and until you have answered the first question, as if this were a job interview, is what story, if somebody were to say, tell me, what's your best story? What is the one that brings all of your skills, all of your tools to bear to this point in your career? What one would you point to?
It would be a story I wrote that's not in the collection. I promise you, there are things.
I'm not doing this intentionally. Like asking about things that are not in the collection.
There are really interesting things in the collection, I promise. But I wrote a piece last Father's Day, and it was about a particular quirk in my family history, which is that my father was 50 when I was born, and I was 50 when my twin sons were born. And so the piece is about being the child of an older father and the older father of children. And so I did a lot of reporting for it, but it was also first person, which I don't do very often, and I don't like doing. But it was a reported essay, and I like doing reported essays, and I found out all of this demography and data about, what they call advanced age paternity. Like if you live long enough, you get your nice euphemism associated with being an old dad.
Like Donald Trump.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's a whole other thing. I would say I don't want to parent like Donald Trump, but yeah. So that piece would be the one.
And then, of course, the follow-up that I always ask, because often job applicants will name a story that won an award or that they consider to be sort of important or something like that. What I will then ask is, can you tell me either the interview or the quote or the thing you observed or something that you stumbled upon that made you go, oh God, I can't wait to put that in the story?
Yeah, and this was, I didn't feel like I can't wait to put this in the story, but I felt like this thing had happened that really, it kind of shook me at the moment. And the minute it happened, I knew that it was the conclusion to a story I had been working on. Going back to the title of the book, Three or More is a Riot, while I was in South Carolina covering the trial of Dylan Roof, you know, I'd spent 2 weeks there, I think. And at the end of it, I'd befriended, like prior to this, a gentleman named Malcolm Graham, whose sister had unfortunately been one of the victims in the church. And at the end of the trial, there's a kind of press conference, and Malcolm gets up and speaks, and he says that he's going to spend the rest of his life telling the world who his sister was and why she was important. And that happens in like the early evening. I leave, go back to the hotel, I get some food. I then get up at like 4 something in the morning and had like a 5:30 flight out of South Carolina. I flew from Charleston to New York to LaGuardia, got a taxi from LaGuardia to JFK, boarded a flight to San Francisco because I had a pre-existing appointment in San Francisco that I thought I was going to have to cancel if the trial had gone any longer, but you know, it ended in time for me to still make this commitment. I land in San Francisco and I realized that I had not spoken to another human being in all of that time. Like I had just been sitting in all of that awfulness, right. And so I get out of the taxi at my hotel, and just to make conversation, there's a bellman who's standing right there, and I said, are you from San Francisco? And he said, well, I might as well be because I've been out here for so long, but I'm originally from Charleston, South Carolina. And I said, oh, get out of here, I'm coming from Charleston now. He said, what brought you to Charleston? And I said, the trial of Dylan Roof. I was there to cover it. And his face just goes blank. And he said, that man took someone very important away from me. And I said, who? He said, my childhood librarian. Her name was Cynthia Graham Hurd. It's Malcolm's sister. And I was like, what? I honestly wondered if I had hallucinated this exchange. And then my instincts kicked in. I was like, can you give me your information? Because the New Yorker has a very rigorous fact check process, and they are not going to believe this. But the thing that immediately registered with me was that I had started the day 5 blocks from the Atlantic, and I was here in San Francisco. I was, I don't know, 20 blocks from the Pacific. And so I'd gone as far as you can go to the other side of the country, and the first person who I talked to had been impacted by the thing that I was trying to get away from in Charleston.
That's almost, it would make me feel like I was living in a magical realist.
Yes.
Horrible, racist, magical realist novel about America.
But what it said to me was that there's no escaping this thing, and that the problem conforms to the contours of the country.
Can you say that again? That's pretty great.
Oh, it was like the problem conforms to the contours of the country.
Okay, I'm just going to let that sit because I think it's almost better if people think about that than if you sort of,
Yeah.
because the book really, that's a perfect thing, at least for me, to end it on, because I think the book fully unpacks what you just spoke about.
Thank you.
It's a wonderful book, where the writing is sufficient to the needs of the topic.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I have a microphone.
Yeah.
If you raise your hand, I'll pass it. Who wants to ask the question?
And just to back up what Paul said, please, for those who, because I'm sure we'll have a lot of people want to ask questions, just please, if you could keep your question focused. Okay, maybe nobody has a question. There you go, over there.
No Oscar acceptance speeches either here.
I was like, I'm leaving and going back to my hotel.
So you spoke about working at a university and politics and students. I'm curious about your thoughts on the ability of students of different political ideologies, races, politics, to speak freely and safely.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a fraught time. It's a fraught time to be able to do that. I think that we don't have a right to be protected, quote unquote, from things we disagree with. And part of that, you know, I tell students this story. I told you I'm a father's son. And so I tell the students the story of when I was a teenager, I used to hang out in boxing gyms, and you know, I started learning how to box. And you know, anyone who has like learned how to box, you know, they walk you through the canon of punches. You know, you practice jab, then you practice, you know, cross, and you practice hooks, and you go through the entire thing until you've like learned what the fundamental punches are. Because I was big and strong, you know, I got very enamored of the concussive pop that the heavy bag would make when my hand made contact. And it would go swinging in the other direction, and I was like very clear that I was a big, strong guy. And then, you know, it came time to spar, and I was sparring with this guy who was like a middleweight. And I was like, oh, okay, all right, I'm just gonna like bully this guy around. And it was weird. He had this very strange boxing style because he kept going like this. And then I realized that he was punching me in the face. It was a delayed recognition. And his hands were so fast that I only saw them as they were coming back. And so I tell my students, hanging out with people who agree with you is like working the heavy bag. And what it does is give you a false sense of how good you are. And then you find yourself in a position where people punch back. And you're going like, wait, am I being punched in the face right now? I am actually being punched in the face right now. And so you do yourself a disservice by not seriously engaging with different views. And you know, for me, I teach opinion writing. One of the first exercises I do with my students is that, you know, I put all the hot button issues on the board, you know, abortion, immigration, you know, if I were doing it this week, I'd say the attack in Iran, but everything that's like a issue where people have strong feelings. And these students, because opinion writing is a self-selecting group, these students are salivating. They can't wait to jump into this. And it's like, your first column is going to be on one of these subjects, pick a subject. And then I deliberately wait until like the last 5 minutes of class and I say, oh, by the way, that column has to be on the opposite of the position you actually hold. And you'll be judged based upon how well you argue this other position. I don't want to slapdash if you're pro-choice, I don't want a slapdash pro-life argument. I want something that's weighty, that's provocative, that makes me actually have to think. And I think that's what education is supposed to do. That said, it's very difficult to do this. We had students who were being doxxed, for participating in the Gaza protests. And that inherently makes it more difficult for anyone to express their opinion or their views. At the same token, we have people who, were kind of pro-Israeli and they felt that they couldn't express their views, or people who didn't want to associate with them, in apolitical clubs, on campus, which I think is also, part and parcel of the same sort of concern. And so I think that we have to build up that fundamental willingness to engage with each other in good faith. And I think there's a way to do that. We don't have to tolerate anti-Semitism, we don't have to tolerate racism or homophobia or people being insulted on the basis of their identity and who they are. It's a difficult needle to thread, but I think it is possible for us to find a landscape where we actually have honest exchange of ideas, and that we treat people as respected members of a community at the same time.
I'm rapidly becoming the Venn diagram man, and I apologize ahead of time. But I'll give you two circles. Mm-hmm. I'd like you to size them and tell me the percent of overlap.
Okay.
The first circle is Christian nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
The second circle is white nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
Size those circles and tell me the percent of overlap.
I think they're probably close to concentric. When we think about Christian nationalism, what we think of as Christian nationalism shares a lot of DNA with the kind of reactionary Christian ideology that emerged in response to the civil rights movement. And that's part of what we're dealing with. And there's a good book by Nancy McLean called Democracy in Chains. And she talks about the ways in which some of the more reactionary elements of kind of current nationalism and white nationalism are, born in that moment where the federal government begins to use its power to enforce equality in the United States. Things that people would think of as, high watermarks of 20th century history, like the 1964 Civil Rights Act or the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And it's out of this kind of sense, this reactionary sense, that people's rights are being trampled, and by people they mean white people, their rights are being trampled, an echo of the kind of mythology of the lost cause. When we think about it, it's pretty amazing where you can have a war that you fight for the right to buy, sell, traffic, rape, abuse human beings and exploit human beings. And you believe in that so much that you're willing to fight to your last man in order to protect that ability. And on the other side of that, when these human beings have been wrested from your grasp, wrenched from your grasp, you decide that you're the victim, that you've been wronged. And I think that there are kind of 2 points. One is that point in the aftermath of the Civil War, and the other is the aftermath of the Civil Rights Movement that are there are other things that happen, certainly the movement for gay rights and Roe v. Wade. Although Roe v. Wade isn't at the center of this early on. Roe v. Wade, it takes a while for abortion to become considered as anti-Christian, which is a kind of interesting fact too. But all those things that become part and parcel of the social revolutions of the 1960s and 1970s that are central to this The update of it is that people begin to think of themselves as being besieged for their white identity.